All right, welcome to Shop Talks, which is a presentation of In Kitchen and impressions, free information. This will all get recorded. You can watch it on YouTube, on the In Kitchen's YouTube channel. We're sponsored by Los Angeles Apparel and AlphaBroder, also Stalls, Reese, Hirsch, and Fairweather Johnson. And I am very happy here to have three screen gurus, Kevin Kauth from Chromaline, Brian Giddens from Kiwo, and Dave Makin from Saati. And we're going to talk a little bit about screen rooms, maybe where you start, where it's advancing to, mistakes people make, etc. All right, so gentlemen, you're just starting out. What's the most important piece of equipment that you need in a screen room when you're just trying to get a little business going? Maybe like a single hand press business. Which thing do you concentrate on first?
Yeah. So me, I would concentrate on having a good light source. That's probably the number one thing that I would focus on. It doesn't need to be the most expensive one. It doesn't need to be huge or anything like that, but it should be a good light source that can expose your screens properly. There's so many people that do DIY and build their exposure unit, and then they reach out and they say, I'm having all these problems. Most of them are exposure related, so having a good exposure unit would be a really good investment to start off with.
I personally started with a 150 watt bulb and a pie plate, 45-minute exposures. I don't recommend it.
Well, the sun works as well, but
when the sun shines.
Exactly. When it's raining and third shift doesn't get much done.
Yeah, I'd like to add that you really need a good output device for your film. We like to really see good transparent films, good all black systems, so that we are duplicating the art properly, so that when you do go to coat your screens, that you are copying the art the best possible.
Yeah, I would say that's the thing I see the most. Like when people are having trouble and there's not opaque black on some kind of vellum, they wonder why the screens come out crappy. Yep, all right. Dave, what do you got?
Okay, I'm going to say in the beginning, as well as an exposure unit and your film positive, is a tension meter. That tension meter will help you control the quality of your screens in the screen room, as well as what's going to happen on the press. So these are kind of the least expensive things, but some of the most important things to begin in the screen making process.
I can't use my thumb and tell how much tension is on the screen.
Some people are that good, but
no, they are not.
No, we.
Some people think they're that good. In fact, a lot of people think they're that good, but that's not a good idea, is it?
But it will really benefit you, not just in making sure you have good quality screens. If your screens are all within tension of each other, it will help with the registration of the press and the time that it has taken you to set up your press and start producing some money.
I was going to say, actually, before any of these suggestions, I think the number one thing you need is patience, right? Practice, and coating screens by hand is an art form. You're not going to be able to do perfect screens on your very first coat. So patience and practice, and you'll get there.
I would add a dehumidifier to my
Well,
list.
We can go down the list. There's
Right?
a million different things that we can add to a screen room.
Right.
But that seems like, when I see people on Facebook that are having trouble, it seems like humidity is a big problem, that they'll be like, oh, I dried it last week and it was fine, and this week, no. And the big difference was the humidity, right? And then those gauges, they cost like thousands of dollars to tell you the humidity in the room, right? No, like I just saw, it was like 3 for $20.
So, one of the biggest things that I like to instill in customers is a process control. If you understand that your art's good, that you're coating your screen properly, you have proper exposure for your mesh counts, all these things are controlling the variables. Once you control the variables, you will have a predictable output at press. So, and all these little small tools, hygrometers, exposure calculators, good coating troughs, all of these things help you be successful.
I want to add to that, when we're talking about our coating troughs, understanding your coating trough, I think, is a big part as well. A lot of shops, as we go into their places, will ask, what side of the coating trough should we use? Because most of them you'll see in a hand coating will have a sharp edge and a round edge. which one's going to build the stencil that you want it to do. You know, in the textile printing, you want to have your emulsion is a gasket between the t-shirt and the mesh. It takes away the mesh interference, so you want to have enough what we call EOM. So just understanding that a round edge will build your stencil and a sharp edge can help reduce some of what we call the peaks and valleys in the RZ, basically where you don't want your ink to go. So build your stencils with a round edge, but education goes a long ways. Ask your rep, ask your distributor, which side should I use? They should have some good information for you on that.
That is actually maybe the first thing you do in your screen room is get hooked up with a company like one of these three that has a reputable product and isn't just trying to sell you something. And it's only 2 companies now, but it used to be 3. And because you're going to need information always, right? Something's going to go wrong, and you need reliable information, not a bunch of bullshit. And so one reason we put on these shop talks, I introduce you to people that are not bullshitters. And these 3, you can't do any better than any of them and some of their colleagues at getting accurate information. So when you buy a product from them, you're not just buying a product, you're buying information. And that's really critical because you're going to find a problem at some point. I don't care how good you are. We've won every award there is, and we've had problems. And when you do, you need backup, and these guys are your backup, these companies. So information is probably the first thing you want in your screen room.
We want you to be successful. If you're not successful, it doesn't matter how good our products are, you're going to have a bad taste in your mouth. So we want to give you the best tools, the best information, so you're successful day in and day out. One of the hardest things that I find with screen printing is repeatability. Can I do this job the same way I did it 6 months ago, a year ago? And by controlling all these variables and having all this information, you know that you're gonna get the end result every time. Documentation is huge. We don't see it a lot in the textile side of it. We see a lot in the graphic side. We'd really like to see textile customers document what ink colors did you use? You know, what was the process of your coating technique, your exposure times? All that becomes very valuable information when you're trying to repeat that job.
And you know, this doesn't have to be like a giant project either. I mean, even as long as we've been doing it, I finally realized that we needed to have our exposure times written on a laminated piece of paper in there so that when somebody's out, nobody's guessing or trying to reach the guy that has COVID to find out what the exposure time is. Or, you know, you don't want anybody to hold you hostage in your business. You don't want your screen guy to be like the only one that knows stuff. So you want to document it like you're talking about.
Yep.
And then you want repeatability, like you're saying. Maybe you can't afford an automatic coder, but you can have the same person code it with the same technique and have the same setup to do it all the time, right?
Right. And there's tools that you can check your stencil. So even if you do have different people coding screens for you, you can measure your stencils and make sure that you're within target range before these things go to press. Everything happens in the screen room. What happens at press is usually too late. So you want to make sure you're making the perfect screen.
They do call it screen printing, don't
Right, they do. And like you said about good information, just because it's on the internet doesn't mean that it's always true, right? Anybody can go out there and put together an instructional video on exposure times and coding and all these things. And I've seen some pretty brutal videos out on the internet. So consider the source, you know, like back in the days of school, you had to cite your sources when you wrote a paper. And it's the same thing, right? So you need to know that your information is coming from a good, reputable source. And you know, any of us, you know, I've got good videos out there that show each step of the process. But once again, consider the source of where you're getting that information.
I love actually, Kevin was in a video where the person was interviewing you and badgering you like, yeah, you can make the emulsion last longer in the fridge, right? And you're like, no, I don't think that's a good idea. And he's like, no, but you know, I put it in the fridge. That's a good idea, right? No, I wanted to like jump in, like, shut up and do what he said. Don't put it in the fridge. You're gonna ruin it.
Well, I mean, there is some truth to that. Obviously, if it's kept cool, diazo will last longer. However, When you bring it out of the refrigerator, now you have to let it get back to room temperature because otherwise viscosity changes. Condensation builds in that bucket, bringing from a cold area to a warm area. So yeah, there's problems that can come up with that, but there is some truth to those stories. But again, is it the easiest way to get things done? Not necessarily.
No, and the way he was presenting it, it was not a good idea.
No, I'd like to kind of just add something to that. You got to know where you want to get to. Will one emulsion work for everything? It can, it may not. If you can communicate to your rep or to your distributor what you have in your screen room, it may be a poor light source, it may be a single coater, it may be what mesh you're using. Sometimes we're trying to get that consistency and that repeatability. Well, if we give you an emulsion, let's say it's too fast, okay? You may not have all your ducks in a row to have that great fast emulsion. So we can build perimeters and give you some leeway and some tolerance. So if your process allows for the better emulsion, fantastic. If it doesn't, talk to your reps and we can give you something that's a little slower, a little bit more detailed capability for your process.
Yeah, actually, Chromaline has, when I was up visiting, you have a product that's made more forgiving for people with basically very, very primitive light sources, right?
Yeah, I mean, we have an entire line of products for each little niche. So we've got one that is designed for that wavelength, that 420 wavelength, which is really goes into the lower end exposure units, like the DIY types of units, that kind of fits that light spectrum a lot better.
Which goes to what you were talking about, Brian. Like printing is, I always say, printing is a system, and changing one thing isn't always a good idea. Somebody tells you, "Oh, this emulsion's great." It may not be great for your system. You can ask a question right now. I'll like. All right. So a very good question. What is fast emulsion?
Yeah, I've seen.
That's when you sell it to them and you run out of the building, right? No.
Yeah, right. No, I've seen some emulsions with matched up with LED light sources. We're talking 3 to 4 second exposure times. That's fast. Now with fluorescent tubes, you could be looking at 10 minutes with a particular emulsion for your exposure time. So really knowing and using the tools, the exposure calculators, the test strips, all of those things are great tools to really know what your exposure time is, and it can be a vast difference. So knowing the product that you have and how that matches up with the light source that you have is very important.
And what you're trying to print, really, also.
Absolutely.
So
the inks that you're using.
Faster is not better. Faster does not equal better. It's like a system. So whatever you're trying to do with the equipment that you have, you need to match an emulsion that will do the best job for you. Sometimes a couple of emulsions. And what kind of ink are you using, right? Are you using water-based ink? Are you using Plastisol? What have you? Are you doing only lettering kind of things? Are you trying to hold halftones? It really can make a big difference, right?
Absolutely. I would say faster means less forgiving. So the slower that product exposes, the more wide that exposure latitude is. So it just means more forgiving. So if you're working in an area that isn't perfectly light safe, you might have to have something that's a little slower exposing just to give you the forgiveness of that product. So you're not worried about pre-exposure and everything that goes along with that.
And the accuracy, right? I mean, if you have an exposure time that's 50 seconds is right and 55 is too long, that's very hard to maintain versus 5 minutes versus 6 minutes or something like that. So the faster ones can be much harder to use.
And then you can also look at capillary films too. If you're looking at a little bit easier way to apply a stencil to your screen, we make films where you can, a little bit of water, you apply it, and then you don't have to have the nice coating technique. You do have a specific EOM to your stencil. So, in a perfect world, we'd have 3 emulsions each. And what we find is we have 300 each between each of these manufacturers. And because we do drill into each company's products, what light sources, what are they trying to achieve, everything that we've been talking about here, one size doesn't fit all.
If we could make one emulsion that did everything, my life would be so much easier.
Actually, the best emulsion I ever used got taken off the market because it didn't ship well. That was a problem. You know, you can't freeze, can't overheat. Some things are more forgiving on that, right? Like some can ship in a hotter temperature or a colder temperature and survive, and even that's part of it, right? Depends where you live. So let's turn it on its head just for a minute. Futuristic. So you got all the money in the world. What are you getting for your screen room these days? You know, there's been real advances, and where's it headed, and what do you got?
I mean, I would say the LTS. You know, Dave can probably elaborate on that as well. But
LTS meaning what?
Laser to screen. Right. So it can do 2 screens at once. It's a proven system that's been out for many years now, and it's an excellent system as far as.
So if people aren't familiar with it, how is it different than traditional exposure? It's pretty different, right?
Quite a bit different, yes. So I mean, the light spectrum, how it matches up with the emulsion. You know, there's no glass, there's no film, so there's no pinholes, you know. So it takes away a lot of the different things that are part of that process. As far as registration, it's putting the image in the same spot every single time, so you don't have to worry about lining up films. So it's a very easy process if you have it in the budget, right? And we can really show you that you can justify the cost of something like the LTS much easier than you think, because there's no consumables being used on that front end. There's no film, there's no ink that's going on that film. The other CTS systems that are out there, there's no ink that's going on the screen, there's no wax that's going on the screen. So because of those no consumables, you can justify it a lot faster.
No bulbs even, right? I mean,
correct.
Right? I mean, that's an expense for an OLED light or something like that.
Yep. So the future is lasers. You know, that's what's going to come down to is, you know, you look back 20 years ago, computer to screen itself with a masking system was brand new. Everybody, I remember when we launched our first machine here at this show, everybody was like, golly, this thing's $90,000. It was more expensive than any press in this facility. And now look where we are. We have laser to screen, we have wax systems, we have inkjet systems, and the game has changed. And in order for you to grow as a company, you're going to have to start looking at laser to screen systems.
If I can say, as you automate your screen room, the first and foremost important part is going to be an automatic coder. Not for ease, not for convenience, but for consistency. Okay, the consistency in the screen room, the consistency in the exposures, the consistency in reclaim. I mean, if I coded today and Brian coded tomorrow, we're going to code differently. Okay, we will do it. You know, mine might reclaim real easy, and maybe Brian was a little tired and he got a little heavy on it. You know, it's going to be a harder reclaim. So an automatic coder is I think the most inexpensive piece of equipment to start with, but the most important piece of equipment to help you advance. Because then if you move into direct to screen, and we're talking about laser to screen and wax and ink, I will always say any direct to screen is better than no direct to screen, because you get the benefit at the press. They shoot in first generation graphics, which means there's not going to be shrinkage or misalignment as a result of a printer and a piece of film. So any direct to screen is going to benefit you, but then you start looking at your cost savings. Where, you know, is ink going to be good for me? Ink is a little transparent. It will do a good job, but you usually get a little underexposure going on. Wax will do a great job with density, and you'll get a good exposure, but you still have a cost going on with it, you know, which is still cheaper than film. And then again, the technology of the future is lasers. It's light imaging, okay, where that light does all the work for you, and you have no consumables whatsoever. So the benefit to get your presses set up and going in half the time, usually if you automate and you improve your screen room first before you buy that third press, it's going to pay for itself that fast.
What we've found over the years of selling computer to screen is that, you know, we always thought the ROI would be with film or handling of this and that. What it is it speeds your registration up so much that you're able to get 2 to 3 jobs more per day going to computer to screen, because of registration and setup times are reduced so much that it becomes a huge game changer. And, you know, these aren't pipe dreams. You know, you really want to drill into the coding machines. You know, you want to fine tune that process so that, you become an industrial printer. You know, we want to see the smooth process. None of us like getting the phone calls of, you know, your emulsion's bad, you know, or, you know, it's falling off the screen. Well, there's always reasons for all that. Once you start to set up this automation, it becomes streamlined and the troubleshooting reduces dramatically.
Out in the field, are you seeing what I am, which is sort of that the industry's going two ways, that you know, where your bigger businesses have trouble finding employees and they want more repeatability, that they're automating every part of it, including the screen room. On the other hand, you have people that just want to, at their house, put their vision on a shirt. Like there's a renewed creativity out there, if you will. I know some of the garment people are seeing it. I don't know if you're seeing it, where really with some pretty primitive stuff, you can still print really interesting shirts. Yes?
Well, that's what's amazing about this industry is, one, it's the most inexpensive industry you can get into with little capital. And two, you can really do everything wrong and still have a workable product. So, you know, the things that we talk about help you become more efficient and more profitable. But we could set up a screen room with probably $200 in our house and produce nice quality prints. So,
I was going to add too, when you look to automating those processes, a lot of times you're eliminating some of the processes along the way. Anytime you can eliminate one of the processes, you're eliminating the chance of something getting screwed up too. So if something isn't exactly dialed in perfectly in one of those processes, say we talk about film, your film isn't printed as dark as it needed to be going to something like laser, well, now you're skipping that entire process. So once again, less chance of having problems.
Problems, really? People have problems?
Many problems. I feel like a counselor sometimes for this job.
Talk people down from the ledge.
Absolutely.
So again, we're talking about automation, but something that shouldn't be overlooked is your mesh. Okay, I still get this question, as I'm sure all of us get this question, is what's the difference between white and yellow mesh? Okay, yellow's detail. It's not a color preference. Yellow gives you detail, but it is slower to expose. White mesh is great for athletic and just block art and things like that, but when we go in and we see somebody exposing both yellow and white at the same time and expecting the same results and they don't get it, it's important to understand your mesh as well as your emulsion and your equipment and your automation as you move into it. But I just thought that would be really important to make sure there is not just a color preference. White is faster, but it doesn't hold the details like yellow does.
And when you talk about mesh too, the other thing that people don't really think about a lot of times is the manufacturer of the mesh, it might be a different mesh count, right? So even though when I go into a shop and I ask them what mesh counts are they using, and they say I'm using 110, 156, and 230, if you have two different manufacturers, the thread diameter might be different. And if the thread diameter is different, that's going to factor into your EOM, it's going to factor into your exposure time and everything. So if you're using two different mesh manufacturers and you're wondering why the exposure times are working well on one and the other, even though it's still 110 screen and a 110 screen, it can obviously factor into it just being the thread diameter. And most people don't think of that as an important spec.
All right, I'm going to ask another question. What do you see out there? I have a few ideas of my own, that things that people do that are penny wise and pound foolish, like where they think they're saving money and it's really not a very good way to save money. I'll give you one because it's a nice one for all three of you. People that want to save money on emulsion, that just seems like a really bad idea. Like the amount of money you can save in a year in a big shop, little shop, whatever, just seems like a very small amount versus like even one or two jobs printing wrong.
Yeah, I did a case study a few years ago. We matched up one of our products, which was 50% solids, with a competitor's product, which was 30% solids. The reason why people look at that 30% solids is because they think it's $5 or $10 less a gallon. But apples to apples, we ended up having to coat with the 30% EOM, a 2 and 2 to match a 1 and 1 with the other product. So now you're adding more labor, you're actually using more emulsion to get the same stencil thickness. So just because a product is cheaper doesn't necessarily mean it's cheaper, because you might have to use more of it.
Right. One of the things that I find if you're trying to cut cost with your emulsion is, you probably need to get out of the business. If that's how you're going to save your company, by reducing the cost of just your emulsion, you might want to look at doing something else. So, you know, you look at the mesh, most important. You look at your emulsion, most important for copying your art. So those two things, if you're skimping on that right off Jump Street, you can almost guarantee that your prints are going to be not so great. So, you know, I'd look at maybe the labor part of your shop instead of trying to cut corners with some of the consumables.
So you would not recommend using vinyl to make your stencils? Okay.
All right, a question? All right, so the question is, if you got how screen tension and say it's supposed to be 35, how close to 35 do you have to maintain it? Is that the question?
I like 5 newtons. You know, within 5 newtons of itself, you're not going to have a lot of shift. You start getting 10, 15, you're going to start to see your image become skewed.
All right, so the other question is, do you take it to the 35 right away, or do you do it in steps?
I think that's a manufacturer spec. Most meshes now, you can almost take them straight up to tension, but let them sit there for a little while. The older processes, the polyester didn't stretch and move as well. They've done a much better job these days. Where
Yeah, that's kind of old school. Like, so, you know, you'll hear that from people that were in a long time ago, where you had to stretch it and let it sit and all that. You don't have to do that anymore with the modern meshes. You don't have to.
Okay, here's the fun part. I get to represent the mesh manufacturer. Okay, Saati does weave their own mesh. We have definitely brought that a long ways, to the point that we weave our mesh under tension so that when you bring it up to tension, you have less loss. The question being, if you take it up to 35, I have to preface that with, can your mesh or can your frame hold 35 newtons? A lot of these aluminum frames are getting cheaper and thinner, and you'll notice that if you request a 35 Newton tension, the stretcher stretched it to 35, but then you'll see a really big bow in your aluminum, okay? So if your frame is capable of it, you can do that. For the most part, we just say keep your screens as close to tension as possible, because that will benefit your registration. I like to stay within 2 newtons. 5 newtons is still very acceptable, but just if you can get all your colors as close together for that press run, you'll have a lot more success.
He's a fanatic. 2 is, you don't need to keep it to 2. He works in a laboratory a lot.
I'm in the field.
No, you don't have to. It depends what you're trying to do, but that's not realistic a lot of times, and you'll be fine with a little bit less.
But the big thing is consistency, right? So as long as, even if your screens are lower tension, as long as there's consistently lower tension, that's when you're going to have success. Because when you go on press and one screen is higher tension, one is lower tension, now you have to have a different off contact. And if it's a different off contact between the 2 colors, you're never going to be able to register that job. So the consistency is key, obviously.
That's a good I know that you should be within the same tension. I don't know why I never even thought about the off contact being the result of why that happens. Other questions? Sure, bring it on. All right, so the question is about screens that aren't flat.
Throw them away.
Well, it can be.
Are these roller frames?
Are they? Well, you should be able to flatten them out. If your screens are racked, you need to level them back out.
You know, well, one thing I also would do is shop around. A lot of people are getting out of roller frames, and they sell those tables. I've seen them really inexpensively out there because they don't really go bad too much, right?
No.
So try to find a table. They have it. Oh, you have one, so that helps. And you guys could better explain why it's not level, right?
We could kind of, we could tell you even afterwards how to fix that. It is a simple thing to be able to fix when you're using roller frames. So, I mean, that racking's going to happen, and it's common with roller frames. So
You are talking about racking and not softening the corners. Yeah. So
It's just the process of how you're tensioning and where you're tensioning when you're basically bringing it up.
yeah, and you want to try to work evenly around your screen. So if you're working one side too much, it'll start to twist that frame. So if you make one turn, make another turn on the opposite side and work it almost like a tire rotation. But count the turns or half turns or put a tick mark on your bolt where you can visually see how far you're moving it, and then you can do the same around the whole screen.
I'm gonna make a plug for roller frames. You know, roller frames get a bad name. We use only roller frames, actually. And the important thing is that you have some system where you can keep your tension up. And I don't know about you guys, you probably see more than me. I see people with a lot of wishful thinking, and they use screens until they break. Like, if you have roller frames, you have to retension them and check them. Like Dave said from the very start of this talk, have a tension meter and know where you're at. If you have pre-stretched screens, you've got to check them. You can't use them forever.
Right.
Like you can, as good as the mesh might be, you cannot use them forever or until they rip. And if you have a stretcher, it better be a good one. Like, I don't know, maybe spend $5,000 or $10,000, like a lot. I haven't seen a lot of cheap ones that work very well. And then when you do that, you're going to have to rip the mesh off and re-stretch sometimes. And I see people, I don't use roller frames anymore, but I don't see them doing anything. They don't send, and then the other thing we do with our rigid ones, send it back to somewhere to be stretched. You got to do one of those things. You cannot wishful think.
And that's one of the benefits now that we're seeing is there's not a lot of customers stretching their own frames anymore. There's houses now where you can send them off, have them stretched to a specific tension, and then they come back to you so that you do have that consistency so that you do get your static frames up to par quickly. But yeah, don't run the mesh until it pops and breaks and tears, and it just becomes a real nightmare for the whole process.
All right, other questions? All right, so the question is, how do you have to worry about the degradation that happens to the screen from chemicals?
So aggressive paste caustic haze removers will degrade the mesh. So the chemistry's changed a lot over the years, so we don't see a lot of it having to be sold. If you're using a good press wash, if you're using a good ink degradant, we try to stay away from abrader dehazers because those will fray the mesh. They seem to be a little popular these days, but it's not a product that I really recommend because over a period of time it does start to slowly fray that mesh. So if you use all the right chemicals, Plastisol by nature doesn't stain. It's when you introduce these hot solvents that you start to see staining.
Actually, I'll make a plug here. What's the product Saati has anyway? The screen prep one that's really inexpensive thing to put on last.
It's a product we call Direct Prep, which does a chemical change to the mesh. Whereas people, like Brian was saying, would abrade their fabric to create more surface area, pits and things throughout the mesh to make the emulsion bite. We chemically alter the fabric using this Direct Prep. It's kind of like when you wax your car, you chemically alter the surface and the rain beads up. Well, we don't want the emulsion to bead up, so we change the mesh, the energy in the mesh, to allow it to lay down and hold on better. So you can get better adhesion, longer print runs and durability, and it's really inexpensive. It goes right where the degreaser would go in your process.
It's like pennies a screen, right?
Yeah. And if you're using something like capillary film, it's also a very good added benefit because essentially it's making water wetter. So it's going to make the water sheet on the screen itself instead of where it just kind of runs down in streaks. If it's a nice sheet of water, when you're applying the capillary film, it's going to absorb into the mesh using capillary action much more evenly across the screen. You know, same concept goes for after the screen dries and you're applying your emulsion, it's going to bond to those threads a lot easier, more consistently.
And then I'll speak from people doing it wrong at my own shop. The Direct Prep, or you have an equivalent one, I think, right?
Ultra Prep.
Yeah.
Chroma wet.
You wash it off under a stream of water. You don't blast it off.
Right. Yeah. Anytime you're working with the degreaser, you want to flood rinse it. You don't want to pressure wash it and blow trash or any particulates back from the booth. We want a nice cascade of fresh water.
All right, got another question here. I like this guy.
Well,
So the question is why you have streaks or not.
That's why you'd want to use one of these mesh prep type products. So it'll actually clean up the mesh. It'll take any contaminants out and give you this nice surface area so that when it does dry, you're able to coat.
So the question is, does it have anything to do with not getting all the degradant off, the ink degradant?
It can easily have to do with that. So if you're using degreaser, it's getting all of the oily substances from the other chemicals off your mesh. You're cleaning the mesh, bringing it back to a raw form. But if you don't get all the degreaser off the screen, that becomes a contaminant as well. So by rinsing that all off, by using a cascade rinse with a garden hose, not using a pressure washer, you're going to get all of that degreaser off the screen because, like I said, if you don't get the degreaser off your screen, it's going to become a contaminant and leave streaks on your screen. And use a degreaser that's designed for screen printing. I see people trying to, you asked before, what's something I see people do to try to cheap the process out, going out and using Ajax or Simple Green or something like that, Dawn dish soap. I see people use these to degrease their screens, and they're developed to clean things, but they're not developed to clean mesh, and they're not really developed to get entirely rinsed off the mesh. So that's the problem with the rinsing of those particular household products.
All right, what other questions? Other questions? Come on. All right, clarification. Just clarification here about when you use pressure and not. You want to just do that?
Yeah, we want to use pressure throughout the whole reclaim process. You want to remove your ink, high pressure. You want to remove your stencil, high pressure. Dehaze, high pressure. Degrease, flood rinse, flood rinse, flood rinse. You cannot use enough water in the last process to make sure that you've removed any contaminants along the frame, the mesh, and you'll get a more consistent coating.
All right. I think, any last things to say here about screens?
Yeah, one other thing that I'm surprised we didn't bring up, but when you're starting out and you're creating a screen room, work under light safe conditions. All of our products are photosensitive. So if there's white light creeping in from the sun from a window that's in your room, that can affect your screen and start to basically expose the outer layers of your emulsion, pre-exposing that screen. So work under yellow light safe conditions and you'll have much better screens.
There are also glasses that you can purchase which will tell you if your room is light safe.
All right. How about a hand for our screen experts? And then they're going to hang out. All right. No, go ahead. What's the other question? One color better than another, like amber, yellow, what have you.
Do you mean as far as like the UV safe light filters? Yeah, so yellow or amber in that is as long as it's blocking the correct light spectrum. So typically I'm looking for it to block 450 and below or even a little bit higher, right? So you want it to at least block that nanometer. So typically I'll send people to there's a website that I use out there. It's encapsulite.com, and I use their safe light filters all the time. It's the yellow G10 filters that they have. They're excellent. So I believe that they're everything from 475 and below that blocks that wavelength, which you'll be fine with that.
Yeah, some of the dumbest interchanges I've seen on Facebook, and there's some dumb ones, are people trying to prove that you don't need those. And they spend so much time on it, I wonder how much money they're making. Not much, I don't think. All right, how about a hand for our presenters here? And I want to thank our sponsors again, Los Angeles Apparel, AlphaBroder, Hirsch, Fairweather Johnson, Stalls, and Reese, and the show here, Impressions. I'm from In Kitchen. Check out our In Kitchen YouTube channel. This will eventually be up there, and stick around for a minute if you want to ask some questions.
Thank you for the invite, Rick.
Thanks for coming.